Hey everybody, I have a video here for you today, and this is kind of by request. I've had comments, questions, asking me why I think Egypt, what we know as Egypt today, is very, very ancient. And there isn't just one thing, there is many things, so I put together a list of 10 specific things that any one of these taken by itself, I think is pretty good proof that Egypt is a lot more ancient than we are led to believe by the standard model of history and the people that promote the Egyptian history that we see today everywhere. And I just think it's wrong, just because there is so much proof. So I'm going to go over the top 10 reasons why I think Egypt is much more ancient than we are led to believe. And people have accused me and others saying Egypt is way, way older, of just trying to sensationalize the story. But for me, I would have had absolutely no problem talking about how the 4th dynasty Egyptians from 4,500 years ago built the Great Pyramids, if that's where the evidence lay. I would have had no problem talking about that. So, to me, it just doesn't seem to fit what we have been taught. So I'm going to go over the top 10 reasons why what we know as Egypt today is much more ancient than we are led to believe. So I'm just going to start that right now. And here we go. Now, this is the famous temple of Edfu, and we're going to go down and just take a peek here, and I'll let Graham Hancock tell you why this is pretty good proof that Egypt is much more ancient than we were led to believe.
What Wynne Griffiths didn't look into was the Edfu building texts at the Temple of Horus at Edfu. Now, these texts tell us that they are extracts from material in the archives of the temple. That material, rather like those old source maps that Piri Reis used, was falling apart, was crumbling, was falling to pieces. And they decided to preserve it permanently by inscribing it on the walls of the temple. And these are called the Edfu building texts. I put this dot surrounded by a circle in the sky here just to remind myself that the Edfu building text described the primeval temple on the homeland of the gods, the sacred homeland of the gods, as an island surrounded by rings of water, exactly as Atlantis is described. And we hear of a snake called the Great Leaping One, who's the chief enemy of the god. His assault causes the homeland of the primeval ones to be swallowed up by the sea. But first, the feet of the deity of the island, the Ka, here explicitly described as the earth god, are pierced, and the domain was split. To cut a long story short, I think that we're looking at the account of the effects of that comet 12,800 years ago. And the Edfu texts speak of the survivors of the destruction of the primeval island of the gods and of their wanderings, and how some of them settle in Egypt.
Now, the next reason I think Egypt is way older than we have been led to believe is the Turin's King's List, known as the Turin Royal Canon. And this was a document by the ancient Egyptians that shows their kings went way back, further in history than the standard model of history, and that what people such as Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass tell you is the history of Egypt. I think we should listen to the people who documented their own history instead of current-day Egyptologists. Current Egyptologists will accept part of this document and give you a king's list going back to the 1st dynasty, but yet they will ignore the earlier part of this document, which is no way to do history, and I think that's absolutely ridiculous. Now, it says here, the 1.7 meter long list tells a different story than that accepted by mainstream Egyptologists. The Turin King's List points to the fact that the first government in the Nile Valley was not of Pharaoh Menes 5,000 years ago, as archaeology believes, but around 11,000 years ago. And maybe I'll make a video in the near future on this King's List. And these dates, I think they clearly go back to a little over 11,000 years ago, and that all makes sense. Now, this is a book written by E.A. Wallace Budge, and he goes over things found in the British Museum of Egyptian History. I believe that's what it is called. But here he writes about stelas and other things besides the Turin's King's List that depicts the rulers of Egypt going way back in history. And right here, some of these kings' name: Sika, Kayu, Tau, Thesh, Neheb, Uchanar, Utakant, and Mecca. These are names of kings who ruled Egypt in the Neolithic period. Is that important that we have documentation of rulers? Sure. All pharaohs are important, I guess, but some are not recognized by current Egyptologists, and that is a shame, because it's history documented by the people who are documenting their own history. And can some of these names be connected to earlier ruins, such as the Labyrinth down at Hawara? Well, maybe. And I think the Labyrinth is another thing that should be mentioned. Just what appears to be a massive underground complex that we have verified through radar scanning, but not a peep from the people who bring you Egyptian history, known as Egyptologists. The next reason is the Dendera Zodiac, which seems to be the oldest timepiece coming from the ancient Egyptians. And what this shows is a starting point of time, and then time spiraling out from the center. Anubis is in the center here, and it seems to depict a time a little over 11,000 years ago. That's what the ancient Egyptians tell us, or where and when their civilization started a little over 11,000 years ago, coming from their most sacred timepiece. That is important. Now, the next reason is that there are no inscriptions inside of the Great Pyramid. The only thing we have it relating to Khufu is a poorly done glyph in a chamber that was never really supposed to be found. And we have Khufu's boat outside of the Great Pyramid. He did what a lot of pharaohs did. They buried a boat outside of a structure to try to attach their legacy to this grand building. And if Khufu would have built the Great Pyramid, his inscription, his cartouche, his scarab, his life story would have been all over the inside. It would have been clear on the outside, and his name would have been written on the sarcophagus, but it's not. Seems there is no inscriptions, just like down at the Sphinx Temple and the Osirian. This ancient stonework was done by people who were here before the dynastic Egyptians, because the dynastic Egyptians inscribed their stories everywhere. Great Pyramid? Nothing. Now the next reason is the Sphinx itself and the Sphinx enclosure, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but it was John Anthony West here who recognized one line in a book written by Schwaller de Lubitz that said the Sphinx enclosure was clearly eroded by water, and here you can clearly see it, and that is clear proof that this enclosure is thousands of years older than the accepted model of history. And in this video, and I'll leave the link below, but he goes over how even Mark Lehner agrees these are old kingdom restoration blocks, but these are form-fitted to fit in the erosion patterns on the Sphinx, clearly saying that the Sphinx was already eroded in the early kingdom that Khafre comes from, who Egyptologists said built the Sphinx. And this erosion pattern from water and the erosion and the restoration blocks on the Sphinx clearly tell us the Sphinx was already ancient and eroded in the Old Kingdom, clearly. Now, the next reason, and I didn't realize this till I made my pyramid series, where I looked at all the pyramids in Egypt, but there seem to be some structures that they call pyramids that they want the history to be totally buried and forgotten. This is a lost, what they call a pyramid at Abu Rawash, the very northern pyramid field. But there are structures up here, and of course the Pyramid of Djedefre is really the only pyramid that they acknowledge up here, but there are two other structures down here that documentation in the 1880s verifies, and they call this the most ancient spot in all of Egypt. But these structures, they don't want the history to come out. And of course, we have the pyramid down at Zayat El Aryan that is now totally covered in trash. And this picture is one of the strangest coming from ancient Egypt. It looks like something out of a science fiction movie. What were they doing? What was the purpose? What is this tub here in these massive granite blocks at the bottom of the descending shaft? Well, that is a true mystery. And instead of, opening this up for tourism, they just buried this in trash. They don't want you to see this. They don't want you to know about it. This comes from a period way earlier in history, and they've tried to cover it up. Now, the next bit of evidence is the lost ancient high technology. And whoever built these original structures had the ability to move enormous stones, carve really hard rock with great precision. This is a look at the Great Pyramid and some original stones. And these are huge. And if we just look around, the inside of the Great Pyramid is a fascinating place, and there has been voids that have been found recently that there is really no answer for. But who would have had the technology to build this original structure? Well, seems machining was used. There have been tests on the sarcophagus found in the king's chamber that says a high-powered drill of some sort is the only way this could have been constructed. And of course, we have the massive granite blocks in the king's chamber that could not have been carved with copper chisels and hammers. So there is really no great answer to this. And also at other sites, such as Abu Sir, this is a video done by the Pukajay guys, and they just have a great channel. And I thoroughly recommend you subscribing to it. And here they show down at Abu Sir some very clear evidence of ancient high technology, some sort of core drill. And I will leave the link for this video, but they go over many different things here on their little tour of Abu Sir, things that really cannot be explained through the standard current model of history, and I'll leave a link for this below. But here you see down below a pyramid at Abu Sir, clear evidence of a technology that the ancient dynastic Egyptians would not have had. And when we are talking about ancient high technology, you have to mention the Serapeum. The Great Pyramid is awe-inspiring, but the Serapeum is just shocking. These huge sarcophagus made out of granite, which are polished and absolutely precision made. There is no logical, adequate answer for these huge sarcophagus that were found underground. How'd they get them in here? How'd they carve them? How'd they polish them? One of the true great mysteries of ancient Egypt. Now, the next reason seems to be depictions of the Great Pyramids of Giza before they were supposedly built 4,500 years ago. I have talked about some artwork and some pharaohs' tombs coming from the First Dynasty, but this is an ostrich egg, and this dating has ranged between 5,000 and 7,000 years old on this egg. And what does this depict? There has been debate on this. Well, it seems to me this depicts the course of the Nile coming up, and these three things depict the pyramids of Giza. And why do I say this is the Nile? Because this, to me, is a depiction of the way it used to look, and this huge outcrop here of water is simply the Fayum Lake that was huge at one point in early history. So, to me, first reaction to this was the Great Pyramids, where they should be, up above the Fayum Lake on the west side of the Nile. And I think that's what we have here. And if this is, say, 6,000 years old, well, the Great Pyramids were already sacred 6,000 years ago. And this was found in a tomb. So civilization was thriving 6,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. And the Great Pyramids were sacred. Now, the next reason is pretty simple, and this was clear all the way through my Egypt Pyramid series. Seems the dynastic Egyptians built on top of original structures that were of much more better quality of workmanship. This is the Black Pyramid down in Dashur, near the Red and Ben Pyramid. But the dynastic Egyptians did not come close to replicating the fine workmanship of the earlier structures, and their attempts, even this one here, just seem to collapse. These mud bricks are still intact, but just the way they built it over a few thousand years, it seemed to collapse. Now, this is the Pyramid of Djoser. They say this is the first pyramid constructed in the 3rd dynasty, yet in the subterranean section of this pyramid, what was found? Objects coming from the 1st and 2nd dynasty. Why would 1st and 2nd dynasty kings be leaving an object in a pyramid built in the 3rd dynasty? That makes no sense. And also, seems this step pyramid was constructed later with mud bricks in an attempt to build on top of an original structure. Now, limestone is harder, a lot harder than mud bricks that were formed by the dynastic Egyptians. And you have all that water weathering in the Sphinx enclosure, and they say that was built in the 4th dynasty. Well, if so much rainfall caused those erosion marks in the Sphinx enclosure, well, these mud bricks would have been totally deteriorated because they are a lot softer than limestone, yet they are intact. That makes no sense. Now, the last one I am just simply going to call the distortion of time. Seems it was a totally different period of history when these structures were originally built. When what we call the Sphinx today was originally built, this was all lake, this was all water in front of it. Today, it's the city of Cairo. We are told that the pyramids were tombs for pharaohs, yet no pharaoh has ever been found in a pyramid. We are told this is a lion, but according to the earliest Egyptians, that is wrong. Seems these structures were built at a totally different period of history so long ago, we have no clue to the original purpose. Maybe we're starting to get a clue these days, but this seems to be built when the climate of Egypt was totally different and the sands were not burying structures, and there seems to be really waterfall that hasn't been around for maybe 7, 8, 9,000 years. Seems to be a totally different period of history. Those are my top reasons why what we call Egypt today is very, very old. We have pre-dynastic ruins and early dynasty ruins on the Giza Plateau because there's ancient sacred structures already existing. Hope you thought this was interesting, and you all have a very nice day.